A good day to all of you. Leeds International School, Form 5 Lower, first midterm, English Literature. We are going to discuss in this particular video the poem Do Not Go Gentle Into That Good Night by Dylan Thomas. So let's move on to the presentation. Now let us focus on the objectives of this presentation. To explore through the poem Do Not Go Gentle Into That Good Night, learn about the poet Dylan Thomas, explore the poem under the following topics: summary of the poem, techniques of the poem, themes of the poem, and possible questions from the poem. Now we will be seeing or we will be going through this particular presentation by focusing onto these objectives. Now let's proceed. Now let's look at the content. That means what we are going to go through in this particular presentation. The first topic that we'll be discussing is the poem. We'll be reciting the poem. Do not go gentle into that good night. Then learn about the poet, background of the poem, summary of the poem, techniques of the poem, themes of the poem, and possible questions from the poem. So these will be the topics that we'll be discussing this particular video on. As our first topic, we will be reciting the poem Do Not Go Gentle Into That Good Night. Do not go gentle into that good night. Old age should burn and rave at close of day. Rage, rage against the dying of the light. Though wise men at their end know dark is right, because their words had forked no lightning they. Do not go gentle into that good night. Good men, the last wave by, crying how bright their frail deeds might have danced in a green bay. Rage, rage against the dying of the light. Wild men who caught and sang the sun in flight, and learned too late, they grieve it on its way. Do not go gentle into that good night. Grave men, near death, who see with blinding sight. Blind eyes could blaze like meteors and be gay. Rage, rage against the dying of the light. And you, my father, there on the sad height, curse, bless me now with your fierce tears. I pray, do not go gentle into that good night. Rage, rage against the dying of the light. Now let us explore about the poet Dylan Thomas. Dylan Thomas was born in 1941 in Swansea, Wales. He began his writing poetry at an early age. In fact, most of his poems were written when he was still a teenager. His poetry was so good that it caught the attention of many English literary figures like T.S. Eliot, Geoffrey Gregson, and Stephen Spender, who helped Thomas to publish his first book of poetry, 18 Poems, at the age of 20. Thomas, unlike many poets, had the fortune of being both well known and well acclaimed during his lifetime. His poetry collections were critical hits, and he participated in multiple tours both domestically and abroad to talk about his work. Though he was successful in his career, his personal life proved difficult, as he was suffering from breathing issues since his childhood. Due to his breathing issue, as well as being an alcoholic, led him to his death at the age of 39. Despite passing away at such a young age, Thomas is considered to be one of the most influential poets of the modern period. Now let us focus on the background of the poem. Thomas wrote Do Not Go Gentle Into That Good Night during a very specific moment in Dylan Thomas's life in 1947. That means the poem was written in 1947. His father, David John Thomas, had first introduced him to the wonder of language by reading him Shakespeare before bed at night. Thomas's father was a grammar school teacher, but he had always wanted to be a poet, but was never able to realize his dream. Some experts suggest that Thomas was inspired to write Do Not Go Gentle Into That Good Night because his father was dying, though his father didn't pass away until Christmas of 1952. In a twist of fate, Thomas Thomas's poem about death would be one of the last poems he would write before his own untimely demise the following year. Now, as you all know the background of the poem, that means the purpose of writing this poem was because his father was about to die, so that is the reason that made Thomas to write this poem. So now we are going to focus on the summary of the poem, where we will see what he has written within the poem, Do Not Go Gentle Into That Good Night. At its heart, Do Not Go Gentle Into That Good Night is a poem about death, that we can see, right? The death is being highlighted through this poem, Do Not Go Gentle Into That Good Night. The narrator of the poem is experiencing the death of his father, which we see in the last stanza or group of lines. Witnessing the death of his father makes the speaker think about death in a more general way. The 5 stanzas focus on different types of men, and the speaker thinks about how they will have to face death one day too. In the end, the speaker realizes that death cannot be avoided, but it can be challenged. When he tells readers to not to go gentle into that good night and rage against the dying of the light, he is telling them not to accept death passively. Instead, he tells people that the last thing a dying person gets to choose is how he faces death. For Thomas, struggling against the death is both a valiant and a human reaction. So that is the summary of the poem. You can see when you read the poem more thoroughly, you will find 4 types of men in the poem, Do Not Go Gentle Into That Good Night. Those people are wise men, wild men, good men, and grave men. And then you can see how Thomas has mentioned his father as a good man, and the category that his father is in, the good men category. So that is a summary of the poem, Do Not Go Gentle Into That Good Night. As we have discussed the summary of the poem, now we are going to focus on the techniques of the poem. We can find a few techniques within the poem, Do Not Go Gentle Into That Good Night. First of all, we find a metaphor. Example for metaphor that we can find in this particular poem is close of the day. That means the end of the life. The metaphor suggests the end of the light. Dying of the light. The dying of the light suggests the night time. That means that they are going to the night time. And also it suggests the death. That means the light of the life is being closed. It's dying. So it means it suggests death. And then we can find a simile in the poem, blind eyes could blaze like meteors and be gay. That is a simile that we find in the poem. Then there are many symbols that we can find in this particular poem. The first symbol is suggested in the topic itself, good night. Good night means death or the afterlife. Then we see close of day as a symbol which shows the end of life. Then the dying of light, it again shows the end of the spirit or the soul. Then sad height, the closeness of death, how close we are to death is shown there through the wording sad height. So these are the symbols that we can find in the poem, Do Not Go Gentle Into That Good Night. Then we have alliteration, learn too late, blinding sight, blind eyes could blaze. So these are the alliterations, learn late, l sound repeating, then the blind sight, we can see blind sight, blind eyes could blaze, the b sound is repeating there. Then we can find the repetition, the word rage is being repeated, and also the whole line, do not go gentle into that good night, is repeated throughout the poem. So these are the repetitions and the techniques we can find in the poem, Do Not Go Gentle Into That Good Night. I have added an extra slide which will show you the structure of the poem. In this particular one, the reason for me to have a topic such as the structure of the poem is because this poem is a special poem because this is a villanelle. We will see what is a villanelle and what is the purpose of the poet to use a villanelle for the poem Do Not Go Gentle. This poem is a villanelle, which is a type of a poetic structure just as a sonnet and a ballad. As you all know, a sonnet has 14 lines and a ballad means which narrates a story. But here, a villanelle has to have 19 lines. That means in this particular poem, a villanelle, that it has 19 lines. The 19 lines are divided into 5 stanzas with 3 lines each. That means the 3 lines we call it as a tercet, and 1 stanza with 4 lines we call it as a quatrain. A villanelle must have 2 refrains and 2 repeating rhymes. If you can go back to the poem and count how many lines are there, you will see that why we call this poem as a villanelle. In Thomas's poem, the lines "Do not go gentle into that good night" and "Rage, rage against the dying of the light" are refrains. In villanelles, the refrain comprises the last lines of the poem. Repeating rhymes occur throughout the poem, and a villanelle has 2 sets of rhymes that do so. In "Do not go gentle into that good night," the rhymes are night, light, right, bright, flight, sight, and height. The B rhymes are they, day, bay, way, gay, and pray. So you can see how A, B rhymes are separated and how they are rhyming with each other according to the structure of the poem, that is a villanelle. So "Do not go gentle into that good night" is a villanelle. Thomas uses a villanelle because villanelles often dealt with natural or simple themes. In this case, death, although scary, is a natural part of life. Since villanelles deal with nature, it makes sense that Thomas chose to use that form for his poem. Repeated refrain echoes the way in which grief works. Even though we know our loved one can't escape death, our minds often find themselves returning to the possibility that they might not die. If only they fight a little harder, maybe they will live just a little longer. The refrain helps to juxtapose the hope of the living against the inevitability of death. Thus, Thomas uses the villanelle to capture what death is like for a loved one too. Now, as we have discussed the techniques, the summary, the background, and about the poet, now it's time for us to focus on the themes of the poem. That will be the last topic of us under the poem "Do Not Go Gentle." Death and defiance. That is the first theme of the poem that we can find. The speaker acknowledges that death is inevitable and everyone dies sooner or later. But that doesn't mean that people should give up and give in to death. Instead, the poet argues that people should fight fearlessly and bravely against death. The second theme is family, grief, and old age. The poem offers universal advice of how to face death with dignity, but it is also intimate and heartfelt message from a son to a dying father. Then the third theme that we come across is anger. The poet tells the reader to rage against dying, and it offers several examples of men who feel their lives unfulfilled, but it does not offer any reason why raging might be more appropriate than despair or peaceful acceptance of absurdity of death. So these are the themes that from the poem we can find: death and defiance, family, grief, and old age, and the last one is anger. So now we have discussed the overall topics that are coming under the poem "Do Not Go Gentle into That Good Night." Now it's time for us to look for some possible questions that can arise from the poem "Do Not Go Gentle." Possible questions from the poem. Now we will look at the questions that are given, and you can answer these questions after going through the video. How many types of men are indicated in the poem, and who are they? What does the poet want the elderly to do when they approach death? What effect do the repetitions in the poem create? Who is the speaker in the poem, and who is he or she addressing to? Compare and contrast the 4 categories of men present in the poem. So you will be very
it will be very easy for you to answer these questions when you go through the video from the beginning by reading the summary, structure and themes of the poem. We have come to the end of our video, and I hope you have gathered enough information for you all to write the answers for the possible questions that are being provided. So have a nice day, and I hope you will be looking forward for the next video.